Good morning, everyone. This is Bobby Sines from the United Way Lower Mainland Healthy Aging. Thanks again to everyone for being here for our grant writing workshop. Just a couple of things before we get started. We will be keeping everyone muted for the presentation, but there will be opportunities to provide feedback and ask questions throughout. This can be done by typing questions into the chat box, into the questions area, and we'll give these opportunities throughout after every logical section. And then I will pose to our facilitators who can then respond to that. We are recording the webinar and we will be sharing it online and via email to everybody that's registered for the event. We'll also be sending out an evaluation on the webinar right afterwards, so we encourage everyone to complete it. I would like to take a minute now to introduce you to our facilitator for today's session. Today we have Barb McMillan, who is the Provincial Community and Sector Development Coordinator with the United Way Lower Mainland Healthy Aging team. Here she is leading the development of the Community-Based Senior Services Sector Network and Knowledge Hub. Barb has over 30 years experience in community organization and network development. She has worked and volunteered with a wide range of community and silver sector organizations locally and globally, including the Vancouver Foundation, Community Foundations of Canada, and City Community Foundation and Health Canada's Health Promotion Directorate. With a focus on partnership and network development, collective impact, granting, and strategic community investment and planning and government, Barbara has provided practical knowledge and tools to assist organizations to increase their capacity, sustainability, and effectiveness. She has been involved with numerous community-based senior support organizations as a funder, consultant, and volunteer, but also as advocate for family members. So I welcome you, Barb, and I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Bobby. I wanted to mention that I was a funder. Bobby didn't say it in so many words, but many of the roles I had over many years was as a funder, and it was as a funder that over 20 years ago I was asked to create and teach a course at BCIT in grant and proposal writing, and I had never written a grant application before, so it seemed a bit unusual, but what they were really looking for was a course designed from a funder's perspective. So what funders were really looking for, how they assessed proposals, how they reacted to information and applications, how they wanted to be approached, to develop relationships with them, all of those kinds of things. However, since then, I have written many grant applications, both large and small. So I can certainly feel your pain for those of you who have written applications in the past. Can everybody see the hand button to click on? Because I'd just be interested in a show of hands to know how many of you have written a grant application before.
And we're seeing a few people raising their hand. It does look like the palm of a hand right on your toolbar. You can sort of just click on that and I'll be able to see who's raising their hand. And Barb, we've probably got about 6 or 8 people of the attendees who have raised their hand.
Great, okay. How many have written more than one grant application?
Again, showing a raise of hands, we've got about 6 or 8 people. And we have one comment who says yes, but not to where I feel it was great.
Okay. And how many have written a grant application that resulted in an approved grant?
Here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got about 7 individuals and comments that yes, approved.
Okay, great. And how many have never written a grant application?
And here we're showing a flash of green hands. So it looks like we've got about 12 or 15 individuals with their hand raised.
Great. Okay, well, we, even for those, I think, who have some experience, this is really a webinar focused on the basics and an introduction. but hopefully those who have written an application before or a proposal and have had some success with it will still get something out of it and learn something new. And for those of you who it's a brand new introduction to the subject, hopefully it will you will learn something and get some ideas and hopefully some confidence in being able to approach grant seeking. And we do plan to do more webinars in future that will go in more deeply in various aspects of grant seeking. But as the dogs are talking about here, we're starting off with the basics. And you know, I tend to talk about grant seeking or grantsmanship because it's really much more than just completing an application form or writing a proposal. It's really about a cycle or a continuum of research, planning, relationship building, and more. And it doesn't necessarily occur in a linear fashion. You might be dealing with different activities and funders simultaneously or over a long period. So you should be thinking about it as a holistic approach that's integrated into your organization. And of course, at every step along the way, it involves keeping track of your research and the plans you're making, the inquiries you've submitted, the grants you've submitted, and everything else that you're doing around grant seeking. You can look at it another way as a process of research, cultivation, proposal development, and submission, and success or not, and stewardship of both the grants that you have received, but as well as the relationships that you're developing. And like many things, good planning and preparation will increase your chances of success. And given the external context that we're operating in these days, which tends to be more competition for fewer dollars, coupled with an increased emphasis on impact, so evaluation, how do you determine if you're a success and what your success looks like, as well as accountability. Organizations really need to pay attention to their internal context and make sure that they're applying for grants from a position of strength. So what does this look like? It's important to commit yourself to applying for a grant only if you match all the foundation or the funder's qualifications, and that you're willing to research and write tailored applications for each foundation or for each funder. Too many organizations go grant chasing, and that often results in mission drift when they're where they're bending themselves out of shape to try and fit into a funder's priorities, and it's really not quite a fit. That's not to say that you can't develop systems and templates so that you can use a lot of material from one grant application to use for another, but you've got to be mindful about making sure that it is customized for the funder you're applying to. For organizational credibility and capacity, this means having a good reputation and dependable people who are knowledgeable about your organization's mission and committed to its vision. And you need to be prepared to commit the resources and time to research foundations and grant opportunities, as well as to invest in training for your staff and or your volunteers. Investing time up front to learn, plan, research, and systematize, that is, developing your capacity for grant seeking, will definitely pay off in efficiencies and greater success. It's also important to understand that grant funds should be only one component of a healthy, diversified revenue stream. Usually recommended to be not more than 20 to 25% for most organizations, although that may vary depending on the type of organization. And certainly understand that some of your grant applications will be rejected, even when it's a good project from a good organization and a good fit with the funder and a well-written application. And keep in mind that no might mean no for now, and that grant writing as a revenue stream is for those who are willing to play the long game. And part of that is developing appropriate relationships with funders. And always plan ahead. Continually gather information on funders and grant opportunities. and get organized. Identify roles and responsibilities within your organization, create a calendar or schedule, create operational efficiencies by having information ready, such as a good description of your organization, current financial data, your current list of board members, that kind of thing. And of course, follow through by responding to requests for more information, by implementing the project, thanking the funder, and submitting reports. Let's see. So the key steps involved are planning your project or your program that you're seeking funding for, identifying funding sources, organizing your approach and scheduling and developing systems. When we refer to LOIs, that might mean letters of intent or letters of inquiry, which are a bit of a prelude or an introduction to your proposal, so that funders are not wasting a lot of time assessing a whole proposal when it may not be a good fit, and you're not wasting a lot of time preparing an application. So it's a bit of a screening tool. And then, of course, the follow-up and follow-through. And of course, one of the first steps is really looking for potential funding sources. And as Gertrude Stein says, there's always money, only the pockets change. And so a key piece of work is to identify those pockets. Typically, this list shows the sources of grant funds. And in Canada, there are over 10,000 public and private foundations, as well as innumerable foundations in the US and globally. Your best shot is funders that are in Canada. However, for some types of projects, there are good opportunities with American or international funders who are interested in local work. In addition, there's government and intergovernmental agencies that provide grants, as well as service clubs, employee groups, and corporate funders. Another thing that many people are not aware of are donor-advised funds at foundations and financial institutions, and these act similar to private foundations, and they're a growing source of grant funding, though usually a little bit more difficult to access, and that takes some relationship building. But if you go and look, for example, at Vancity Community Foundation's website, you'll see a list of their donor-advised funds will come up. And there's well over 100 of those donor-advised funds, and the site shows you what kinds of things they're interested in supporting. So if you see something that looks like a good fit with your project, you can contact the foundation to learn more about it and see how you can apply for a grant from that donor-advised fund. Just a word on trusts. In BC, we are very fortunate to have a number of really significant trusts that were set up in many cases by the provincial government, such as the Columbia Basin Trust, ICE-T, which is the Island Community Economic Development Trust. We have the Northern Development Initiatives Trust and the Southern Interior Development Initiatives Trust, and several others. And if you live in those geographic areas covered by those trusts, some of them focus more on things like economic development, but others also focus on social development, and are worth taking a look at to see if they have a funding program that's a good fit for you. You can do a lot of research by just Googling, and one thing will lead to another, and before you know it, you've spent several days at it and have a fairly good prospect list. You can get a head start on the Googling by looking at websites such as Charity Village or the Victoria Foundation, for example. Although they fund primarily on Vancouver Island and in the Victoria area, they have a really good list of other funding sources that are relevant to a lot of other areas. Likewise, the Northern Development Trust. And these include links to various other databases. But the number of paid data, those are all free. And but there are also paid databases, and they've increased significantly in recent years. Ones like GrantStation, Asia, Fund Tracker, Foundation Search Canada, iWave, CharityCan. These typically have some limited information that you can look at no charge, but they require a paid subscription to capture any kind of detail. Imagine Canada has a paid database called Grant Connect, and if you are in the Vancouver area, it is available through the Vancouver Public Library to anyone who has a current card, but you actually have to be in the library to access it. For those of you outside of the Vancouver area, it may be worth checking with your local library and perhaps requesting that they get a subscription to Grant Connect that could benefit all of the nonprofits in the area. A really good resource because, you know, all of these paid databases can be quite confusing and quite expensive for organizations that can afford them. They even tend to be of limited value. You know, they might get a subscription for 1 year and mine it for as much information as they can and then just leave it for a few more years. But to tell the difference and, you know, which ones are better, TechSoup Canada has a really good article that I can send the link for that provides good advice and recommendations on subscriber-based databases. And they sometimes also have discounts that they offer to nonprofits on databases like this. And as I mentioned, there are other free databases, some like with the Trust or Victoria Foundation, but there's others like Funds for NGOs, and I can provide a list of them after the webinar. But this is where to start, and you can spend a lot of time searching, but once you've done a really comprehensive search, then you can get to work on trying to contact these funders. Just wondering, some of you might have other ideas about how you can identify potential funders. If you do, please type them in the message box and we'll read them out.
We'll just give it another second. I don't see anything coming in yet, Barb, but we can always, if I see anything, I can always jump in and let you know what.
Okay, so some other ideas might be past donors or word of mouth, just getting the word out about the amazing work that you're doing and how valuable it is and the kind of impact it's having, because that can be a really good way to find out who's got a brother or a cousin or a neighbor who happens to have a family foundation or is involved in a service club that's looking to support good projects. You can also watch out for who the donors are for similar organizations. And that can give information on a donor's priority and interest that might not be available through online sources. For example, donors that don't have websites or aren't listed in databases, as is the case for many corporate donors. So
we wanted to add that Patty has said grant and aid from regional district or city council. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, most municipalities have grants and aid, and they're good sources. And for many of them, operational funding, which can be some of the hardest funding to get. In terms of your search, the basic filters that you'll use to narrow down the fit between what you're seeking funding for and the funder's interests are eligibility. For example, charitable registration. Most funders won't fund individuals. If you're a business or a for-profit, you need to look to a whole different set of funders. Many foundations can only fund registered charities. And so if you're not a registered charity, but find that there's a great fit with the funder, then you need to partner with another organization that is registered as a charity with the Canada Revenue Agency. Subject area is a real key one. For example, whether you're a health organization, social services, education, or employment, or an arts organization. And then, of course, the geographic area where your work takes place. Community foundations tend to fund in their local community. For example, the Quesnel Community Foundation would just fund in the Quesnel area, or the Cranbrook Foundation in the Cranbrook area. And then the type of funding you're looking for, whether it's a capital request, it's a project or a pilot program. if it's just operational funding, that you're looking for support to cover your ongoing operating expenses, scholarship funds, or if it's technical support. Many funders limit the types of grants they give. Some will only fund capital expenses. Others won't fund personnel or staffing costs. Some will fund staffing, so that's something that you need to be looking for and use as a filter. And then, of course, the amount that you're seeking. You won't be going to a small community foundation that typically gives grants of under $5,000 if you're looking for $50,000 from one funder. And then, of course, the timing. And that's whether it's just a short-term grant or if it's multi-year, and how often a funder accepts proposals, whether they have ongoing intake or whether they have one deadline a year or two deadlines a year, and how long they take to process requests, because very few funders fund retroactively. And once you submit a proposal, they need the time to assess the application and make their decision and notify you. And for by far the majority of funders will not fund any expenses that occur prior to the date that they notify you that their funding is approved and valid. So funding databases make this fairly easy, all of these research filters, and you can just check boxes for each of them and include several keywords to do your searches. So I'm not sure how many of you have actually used any kind of a funding database, but it's, and unfortunately we don't have time to do a demonstration now, but it's pretty straightforward. And even for some of the free databases, you can use this. So that really helps you narrow down the types of funders that you should be looking at. In many databases, though, you won't see the government funding programs. And so that's where your Google searching and relationships will help you identify those potential funders. So you really
want to jump into the question?
In just a minute, we'll take some questions on this section. Okay. So yeah, you want to in doing this narrowing down with your filters, you want to really understand the interests and priorities of the funder, what kinds of things they funded in the past, their history and their capacity. So how much, the typical size of the grants. One thing to look for, you may see a lot of foundations that, the average size of their grant is 50,000 or 100,000. And then when you actually look at the types of grants they're giving, for most organizations, it might be 5,000 or 10,000 or no more than 25,000, but they're giving a few very large grants, like $1 million to, the University of Toronto or to Children's Hospital. And that's because some family foundations have very strong relationships over time with some organizations that they do give a lot to, but then their competitive types of grants that they accept applications for tend to be much smaller. So you want to look not at the average grant size, but at the medium and at their list of grants to see what kinds of amounts they are providing to what kinds of projects. It's also, of course, critical to look at their application requirements and their process so that you understand their deadlines, what they expect, the kind of information you need to provide, and follow it to the letter. And it's helpful also to know their decision-making process, whether it's all internal, whether they have an external review committee, and what they base it on, so that you make sure that you're sending in the right information and attachments. And if they do have contact information, and many don't, but many do, if you can phone them, and if you've got questions, or if you can arrange a meeting with them. Some say that they won't have any contact, some by email, so it really varies across the board. And then there are some who encourage you to call them or to come and meet with them to discuss your project. So it's variable, and that's part of your research, is to know the funder and whether there is an opportunity to speak with them. So essentially, funders are looking for these things. Does the proposal fit their interests, their priorities, and their guidelines? Your credibility. Do you have the reliability and reputation to be a potential grantee? Do you know what you want to accomplish? Are you achieving your goals? and your capability. What skills do your board and your staff and other volunteers bring to the project? Have you succeeded in other such initiatives? And is it feasible? Does the proposal advance a worthwhile project built on a good idea that can successfully be implemented by the applicant? In other words, can it be done? And of course, the budget is really critical in assessing feasibility. And how important is it? Should it be done? Will it make a difference? Given all the other requests, is this the one to support? And for corporate funders, they're also often looking for marketing opportunities, for visibility, for employee involvement opportunities, and recognition. Foundations, specifically, typically are looking to make their giving programs meaningful, and they're seeking consistency with their organizational mission, and they want to follow their donors' wishes. So that's the fit. And many are also looking for the opportunity to make a difference. And more of them are starting to evaluate their own granting programs, and they want to know that something will have changed as a result of the work that they're doing in the programs they're supporting. They're often also looking for the opportunity to make a point. They might be interested in supporting overlooked issues or want their name associated with a particular cause. And the opportunity to build organizational and community capacity. This is increasing because they recognize that for many organizations, they know their work. For example, the stream keepers know stream keeping, and the beekeepers know beekeeping, but often it's a challenge to run an organization effectively when there's so much to know about, governance and fundraising and financial management. For many, they're also looking for opportunities to build organizational and community capacity. Many funders see their work as an investment in organizations and in communities. And what's really key for pretty well all funders is they're interested in results, in sustainability, in accountability, and for some of them, replicability. They're accountable to their own mandate and mission and/or their donors, and thus they require accountability in the grants that they make. And increasingly, funders are interested in the evaluation and dissemination of project results to add value to their grant making. And so essentially, you want to be keeping track, and as you might realize by now, funder research can be very time consuming, but if you develop systems, it will make your work more efficient, and of course it's essential to keep track of all of your research as well as the progress you're making, what grants you have applied for and what the response has been. And your research should be ongoing. So you want to develop your grants radar, and then you'll start noticing funding opportunities all over the place that you may not have noticed before. And then just before we take questions, the previous slide showed a bit of a chart for all the different funders you might be approaching initially. And then as you narrow it down to funders that seem to be really the best fit, and certainly ones that have provided some support, you'll want to have a really good system in place to record and regularly update all of the details of the grant and the relationship you have with the funder. Okay, so before we move on to the next section, what questions do we have?
So I'll just invite everybody to go ahead and post some questions at this time. But one comment that did come in a few slides back from Laura talking about linking in with another charity. She says her agency is often asked to be an umbrella for non-charitable projects. Funders are requiring us to prioritize, which means that we are having a really hard time now supporting those outside requests, regardless of their urgency or value for the community. And she's just feeling how it's very counterproductive for her at this time.
Yeah, and that's completely understandable because it's tricky. And there's some very specific rules that CRA has around those relationships. There needs to be a contractual relationship between the charitable organization and the non-registered organization. And the charitable organization, which is the actual applicant, takes on the legal and financial responsibility for the project. So that's a pretty big deal. And many organizations in that situation will actually attach a fee, 10 to 15%, because it requires their resources, their staff time, to be able to do this. And they need to have their board support, so they need to have certain systems in place in order to do this, and a lot of trust with the organization they're sponsoring. So it's definitely not for every organization. Another real key feature of that is there needs to be some kind of a relationship. It can't be just like a sponsorship of convenience. There needs to be some relationship between the organizations, as well as some similarity in terms of overall goals. Like, you wouldn't have an arts organization that is the sponsor for an environment group, doing a stream cleanup or something. So there are conditions that must be met for to keep CRA happy. If people want more information on that, and there are other organizations that are happy to do it. Certainly some municipalities and some school districts do this, but not all. And some have said no, that, for various reasons they won't do it. So it will really vary from one community to the next what your options might be if you aren't a registered charity. But if you want some good information, the website of the Sunshine Coast Community Foundation provides some guidelines around what that would need to look like if you are partnering with another organization that will be the applicant. Are there any other questions, Bobby?
Great, thanks, Barb. No further questions at this time, but I encourage everybody, if you do have some, to feel free to post throughout. And actually, Coletta just posted, before we move on, read data collection, stats, research. Many organizations access funding based on numbers served. However, as a community partner, we are aware those numbers are not accurate. Generally, our numbers tracked as individuals or service points.
Sorry, what was that last sentence, the question? Generally?
It is. Coletta, maybe you can reword that. It says generally are number tracked as individuals or service points. So I'm not exactly sure what Coletta's saying.
I'm not sure, but you're right that many funders do want to know how many people you're reaching. Many want to know how many volunteers you have. They will get very specific, and some of what's behind that is there are funders who are just looking to, for the greatest number of people that might be reached by the project, and whereas others might be looking for the actual impact, the deeper change. So sometimes we talk about it as being the impact like a mile wide and an inch deep, or an inch wide and a mile deep. So there are some funders who, if your project is going to affect only 20 people, but in very profound ways, like bring them out of poverty or change their life, get them off the street and into stable housing, then that's what they're hoping to do. They recognize that that deep change is really important as well, whereas others are more interested in reaching the broadest number of people. So that's part of knowing the funder, your research and getting a good idea of what their interest and motivation is.
Thanks for that, Barb. I think you can go ahead.
Okay, so typically this is what funders want to know. These are the basics. They may have other potential questions, and we'll look at some other questions, but it's kind of like the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And a key piece is, what difference will it make? And of course, why. The why is really critical. And the answers to these questions are the components of a typical grant application or proposal. And different funders may have different terminology and formats and levels of sophistication. Some funders will provide an application form, others will list the components that they want to see included, and then you just kind of do it freestyle based on their headings. And while applications are increasingly submitted online, there's still some that actually require you to print and mail it. So there's everything in between, but increasingly applications will be submitted either through an online system, and many that actually limit the number of words or characters that you can use to answer each question, or by email. so emailing it as an attachment. So there, as I mentioned, there will be others, but these are the basics. And you know, you'll have a description, a project description that tends to include things like goals, objectives, strategies. Some might use the word tactics instead of strategies. Some might use work plans or timelines or activities, but they're pretty straightforward overall. You heard me mention LOIs previously, and these are typically like mini proposals or a concept paper, usually about 2 pages, or if they're online, they might be limited to a certain number of words. I've seen recently, though, some LOIs are getting to be almost more like proposals. I've done a few in the last few years where it's much more than 2 pages, but then when it actually, if it's accepted and you're invited to submit an application, then there's not a lot else to add. So it, again, like many things, it varies from funder to funder, but part of your research will help you understand what's expected. In an LOI, I usually suggest that you lead with the need. So don't spend a lot of time just introducing your organization. You, of course, do want to introduce your organization, but you want to talk about fairly early on, either the first or the second paragraph, get right to the point about what the need is that you're planning to address with your proposal. And as a screening tool, as I mentioned, LOIs can save the funder and the applicant a lot of time. But LOIs can also be good for cold calling. So if you're doing a funder search and you find a number of funders that the information you get says that they support healthy aging projects or meal programs for seniors, but then they don't have any information about applying, then an LOI is recommended, where you get, it's like your mini proposal and you send it to them to see if they have an interest in what you're doing. So it can be both a screening tool that foundations use, or it can be just an inquiry that you're making as a way to introduce your project and try to establish contact with the funder. The description of the need or the opportunity, I always think, is a really key part of the proposal. It provides the rationale for why this is important to support, and it should describe the nature and extent of the problem or the opportunity and why the applicant is in a good position to do something about it. So it's really important to include data to substantiate the need, but it's also important to talk about those numbers in really human terms, that is, telling the story of how individuals are affected by the problem that you have described. And so we often say no numbers without stories and no stories without numbers. And it's because numbers tend to appeal to the head while the stories appeal to the heart. And you want to hit both. You want to get people to understand that the project makes sense, that if you do the work that you're proposing, it will address the need that you've described, but you also want to make sure that it's compelling, that people understand how people are affected by the problem and that it's humans, and get it right down to that individual level of how people are affected by the issue. In your project or your program description, and I'm using project and program quite interchangeably, although they are different. Typically, a project is time limited. You know, it's purchasing a piece of equipment, or it's, you know, developing a workshop curriculum or preparing a manual. So there's a start and an end to it. But in some cases, it might be a pilot project. So while there is a start and an end, there's also an expectation that if it is effective and has good results, then you will want to implement it longer term. A program is a longer term initiative. It's something that your organization is doing on a regular basis to in support of your mission. So these are the typical components of a project or a program description. And as I mentioned, though some funders may use different terminology. I'm assuming everybody knows what we mean by SMART objectives: specific, measurable, attainable or achievable, realistic and relevant, and time-bound. So again, I can send you some information as a follow-up that gives some examples of a program plan that includes a goal, a project rationale, the objectives, and strategies, activities, and an evaluation plan. When we talk about strategies, we're typically talking about the way you will work. It's not the what you're going to do, but it's the way you'll work. For example, target group participation. We often hear nothing about me without me. So it would be, a strategy would be including older adults in your planning. Or it might be, another strategy might be collaboration and partnering with other organizations in the community. Whereas the activities are the specific actions or tasks that you will undertake in your work plan and to achieve your goals and objectives. So the budget is always a really critical piece of the proposal, and if it's not detailed and if it's not accurate or balanced and realistic, it will usually result in not getting the grant. So it should always be broken down to sufficient detail to show how the figures have been arrived at. It flows and is informed from the work plan. So what I've often done is in my work plan, for every activity, I include what are the resources, and some of those resources will be in kind, like volunteers and donated space for meetings, and others there's a cost to them. But essentially you need to attach a cost to every activity in order to formulate your budget. It should always include both revenues and expenses, and your revenues should be anticipated as well as those that are confirmed. And as mentioned, the in-kind resources, what you're not having to pay cash for, but are being contributed either as volunteer support or contributed materials or space. And you want to make sure that you're putting things in the appropriate categories. Many funders will give you a form that you need to complete, and many will have a space where you can put your own categories if some of your expenses don't fit into the categories that they have named. And again, explanations. You need to include as much detail as possible so they're not left with unanswered questions, because you know, having reviewed many proposals over the years, I can say that that's often, you know, in probably half or more, it's the budget that's the, you know, things look really good until the reviewer gets to the budget, and then the budget looks like it's either inflated or it doesn't make sense, or they don't really have a good idea of where all of the other revenues will come from. So it must be detailed, realistic, and accurate, and of course it must balance. In many cases, they will provide a space so you can include explanations because there's often not enough room in some of the budget forms. So take that opportunity if necessary to include details about how you arrived at a lot of your figures or what some of the variables might be. So there are some other types of questions that funders may ask, and of course it depends on the funder and the type of grant you're looking for, and of course the amount. You can typically expect that if you're looking for a $100,000 grant or a larger grant, that there will be a lot more questions. And the ones that are listed here are fairly typical. Challenges, risks, or barriers, and how you expect to overcome them. How many volunteers are involved, directly or indirectly, and how many people are affected or will benefit from the project, both directly and indirectly. Who's the target population? And sometimes they'll ask for characteristics and what you know about them and how you know. They'll often ask who have you consulted about the project, as well as who you're partnering with and what's the nature of the partnership. You'll also often get a communications plan. Sometimes they'll ask for CVs of key project staff. And in some cases, particularly government, but also corporate funders, they'll want to know how you will acknowledge them. And in some cases, how they can participate. For corporate funders, they're often looking for opportunities for their staff to volunteer at a grantee's event or in their programs. Any questions up to now?
We'll just give it a minute for if anybody wants to post a quick question or raise your hand. I know if you're aware that your audio is able to work, I don't mind opening up the line to you as well. Not seeing anything at this time, Barb, so maybe go ahead and proceed, and we can always come back and check in if somebody does it.
Yeah, so those are all the basics that you'll see in most grant applications, and a few extra things like that last slide. But once you've filled in on the application form or in the proposal you've drafted, once you've answered the questions and filled in the basics, you want to refine the proposal, because it's one thing just to put down all of the information, but you want to make sure that it's hitting the head and the heart, like I mentioned. So when you're refining it, you want to make sure that it's as clear as possible and concise, because they don't have a lot of time, and you want to make every word count, and it must be complete. You want to make sure that you are not missing any questions or any attachments. They're typically also asking for things like financial statements, whether audited or unaudited, operating budgets, as well as project budgets, board of directors. So you want to make sure that it is complete and that you've included everything they've requested. And of course, it needs to be compelling. They're looking at a lot of applications typically, and so you want to make sure that yours is standing out, that it is going to make a difference, and it's a great fit with what they're interested in, and how it's a fit. And of course, accurate in terms of the information you're providing throughout, but also in terms of the budget. So let's take a look at how you can be trying to do that refining in each of those areas. In terms of clear writing, plain language is really important. Avoid jargon, colloquialisms, and uncommon or extraneous words and phrases. A lot of people include a lot of redundancies, and the great thing now is if you're doing online applications, it forces you to be really concise and avoid extraneous words and phrases. You want to make sure that you're using really good grammar. Funders surprisingly get distracted, or maybe not surprisingly, will get distracted if it's inconsistent tenses. If you're sometimes using the third person and sometimes the first person. So you want to be consistent throughout. You want to make sure that you are using proper grammar and punctuation. And consistency in your punctuation and your spacing between sentences, for example. Use the active voice. Speak directly to the reader. And of course, shorter sentences tend to have more impact. And also a mix, some shorter sentences, some longer sentences. So not a lot of long run-on sentences, but also not a lot of really short sentences. So good variation and flow. And I've mentioned not just consistent tenses and pronouns, but you also want to have appropriate tenses and pronouns. I've seen applications that, both the cover letter and the applications is, I will do this, I. And it's really off-putting because, you want to see that it's coming from a team that's working together. So if you are using the first person, it should be we. But for some applications, you actually want to use the third person. But in any case, you want to be consistent throughout, not just flip back and forth between the first and the third person. Should have logical order and good flow. One idea should flow to the next. I've seen a lot of proposals where just moving a few paragraphs around can make a big difference in terms of making it flow better and easier to understand and follow. The style should be appropriate, and the degree of formality usually depends on how well you know the funder, what kind of a relationship you have with them, or the particular circumstances. Typically, if you're, if it's a more academic proposal, it's going to be more formal. If it's a funder or, a family foundation that you know really well and have had a relationship with, it might be less formal. So that's a judgment call usually, but never get too informal in a grant application, because again, you're not necessarily sure who is going to be reading it. And only use acronyms after the name or phrase has been spelled out on its first use. Certainly there's a lot of other tips, and we'll look at some others, but these are the main things you want to be thinking about in terms of clear writing. You also need to think about clarity for the actual presentation. So things like a really effective layout, breaking up long stretches of narrative by incorporating headings, presenting detail in point form or numbers, or using charts or tables. Paragraphs shouldn't be too long, and certainly solid blocks of narrative can be really daunting to the reader, or if they're too short, it can be quite distracting. So right sizing of your paragraphs, but also making sure that you're using headings and bold font or italics and underlining where appropriate to show where the headings are. But again, there are some, especially government applications, where it can be difficult in their online format to do that. But as much as possible, you want to make it really easy on the reader, and think about their experience, the reader experience, where sometimes they'll remember something and they want to check on it and they have to go back, and it's much easier for them to find it when there are headings that take them right to it. Likewise, think about how often they're reading 20 or 30 or 50 or more applications, all over the course of a day or two. And then when they sit at the review meeting, they need to go back and find something. And so you want to be able to make it easy for them, if they want to hone in on the evaluation plan or something like that. It's a lot easier when you've done a really clear presentation. And you'll want to number the pages for longer proposals, especially include a table of contents. Again, always be thinking about your audience and the user experience and make it as clear as possible. You want to aim for sharp and vigorous writing. Eliminate unnecessary words and phrases. So this is for making it concise. A lot of redundancies are often used. Like we are of the belief that, when you can just say we believe. So again, be thinking of that as you do some of your proofreading, and eliminate every extraneous word or phrase. We talk about high carb phrases where it's, you've used 4 or 5 or 6 words when only one is really necessary. Gratuitous intensifiers and qualifiers, you see this all the time. Things like, this is an amazing project, or, this is really innovative, but you don't actually say why. So avoid words like that, and be really specific as possible. So the word should actually be very, not just specific, but descriptive. And, words like amazing, what does it really tell you? And also avoid cliches. So you want to reinforce certain concepts, but don't repeat them. Find other ways to describe rather than repeating them over and over. And you will find that with some funders' forms, it seems like they're asking the same question several times, but in different ways. I've found that, other people find that. And, there's not much you can do about it from their end. Because you're not going to call them and say, this is a dumb question, or you need to change that. But what you can do is use it as an opportunity to, if you've got really important information about your project that there doesn't seem to be a place to fit it into their questions, try and fit it into those areas where their question seems redundant and you've already really answered it. That gets into a bit more of the advanced grant writing, but it can be helpful to know that sometimes you will see questions and it's not you, it's them, that their application forms are just not really well thought through. And just as we try to make things reader friendly so that the reader can easily understand it. Unfortunately, there are funders that don't think that way about their readers and the people that are having to complete the grant applications. So the key around making it concise is to make every word count. You hear me talk about compelling a lot, and what that's really referring to is being able to reflect the passion and the vision of your project. So you want to be bold and descriptive and action-oriented, but you don't want it to get schmaltzy. So it should be honest and sincere and factual and realistic. But it is a balance of intellectual and emotional appeal. So, you know, when I talk about schmaltzy, you don't want to go for drama or the kind of emotion that's commonly used in direct mail campaigns. And a great way to make it compelling and inspirational is to use examples and stories and quotes mixed with data. So again, it's that balance of intellectual and emotional appeal that will really make it compelling. And accuracy is absolutely critical. So that's everything from ensuring that all required questions are answered, that your facts, your data, your quotes, and any citations that you use are correct. And data should be not just correct, but it should be as current as possible. And ensure that your board member listing is correct and current. Sometimes I've gone to websites where the list of board members on a website is, you know, 5 years old. So you suspect it very well may not be current. And this is really important for accountability purposes. And of course, your budget. So check and recheck the addition and your multiplication. Make sure that the amount you're requesting in your cover letter, and usually there's a space at the beginning of the application for how much you're asking for. It needs to be consistent with budget figures. And I've seen it many times, and in fact, I'm guilty of it. I've done it where, because after working on the budget, the amount we're asking for has actually changed, and I haven't gone back and changed it in the front of the application. So I really make sure to avoid that mistake again, but a lot of people do that. And it's an easy mistake, but it's one that you've got to really check on, because it can be quite confusing. The funder will be wondering, you know, so what are you asking for, the amount in the budget or the amount in the letter or the amount at the front of the application? And a complete application, I always, even if they don't ask for a cover letter, I always recommend doing a cover letter, except of course in the case where it's an online application form and there isn't the provision for that. But if you're emailing an application, you should also email a cover letter. And then of course your proposal or the application form and any attachments that they have required. And any support letters, and you know, where support letters are required, you really want to get onto it early, requesting them from project partners or supporters, because that's often something, you know, people are often happy to do it, but they need a bit of time. And in many cases, it really helps if you offer to write the support letter for them, because then it will make sure that it's relevant and, you know, consistent with the project you're applying for. I heard from one federal funder, it was New Horizons as a matter of fact, where they described a case that a support letter made it sound as if the project had already happened, and the application was disqualified because of that. And it was just a simple mistake. So you really need to make sure that whoever's writing the support letters is right on top of it, and it's consistent with your application. And then for some funders will require a table of contents, but even if they don't, it can be helpful if it's a longer proposal. It's very useful. And I also highly recommend framing for the funder. So pointing out in your cover letter how it's a fit, how your project is a fit with their interests and priorities. And that helps demonstrate that you've done your research, that you know what they're interested in. And if there is not a executive summary or a project summary required in the application, then use that in your cover letter. because again, when reviewers are looking at a whole lot of applications, having a concise description of the project right up front, you know, if it's not in the application, then in the cover letter, that's really helpful for them as a reminder of what your project is all about. So when you want to do that reviewing and refining, here's some strategies, and you'll see that word proofread mentioned many times, because you know you really need to go over it several times, because you'll pick up things that you didn't pick up the first time that you proofread. So especially when writing a lengthy document, it's really easy to miss typos and errors in grammar and punctuation and inconsistent use of tenses, etc. And it might take several reviews to catch every mistake. And proofread by reading out loud. Even when reading silently, most readers are saying the words out loud in their mind. So reading a proposal out loud helps you to hear what the reader will hear, and helps you notice such things as how well it flows, too frequent repetition of words, inconsistencies in tenses and pronouns, grammatical errors, use of jargon, and run-on sentences. Having another person proofread is very helpful too, because often the writer is too close to the project and the proposal to be really critical and objective. Feedback from somebody who's not familiar with it will help identify problems such as typos, grammar and punctuation errors, etc., use of jargon, but it can also help identify bigger problems. So do they understand it? Does it make sense? Does it add up? Are they left with unanswered questions? Does it engage and motivate them? In other words, is it clear, complete, and compelling? And of course, you know, use calculators, dictionaries, thesaurus, and spell check, and review all the references you've used and data against the original material. And any links you're putting in online applications, make sure that they work and are functioning. It can be very helpful to use a checklist. Some funders do provide a checklist. Others don't, and so making yours can be very helpful, especially for larger proposals. I won't go into detail on this, but this is typically what funders are looking for in evaluating grant applications, and they'll often take a three-pile approach where they sort through, and you know, the first pile is probably yes, this looks great. Second is maybe, not sure yet, and then the third is probably no. And then they go through and focus their time and efforts on the first two piles. So you want to make sure that you're in, ideally, the first, but if not, then definitely the second. And keep in mind that funders are human, and that there often is subjectivity and biases involved in their decisions, and that funders talk to funders, both in informal networks, but also often as part of their assessment process. And some funders will tell you how they rate applications. Some do it on a numeric basis. Others, it's more, you know, just overall how they, how well it fits, and how practical it is, and its likelihood for success. So that, again, is part of your research and trying to understand their evaluation process. And I know we are getting short on time, but just to quickly wind up, the proposals that stand out demonstrate a really clear fit with funders' priorities and their interests. They describe an important issue or an opportunity and what you plan to do to address it. They highlight a credible organization that has the ability and the capacity to do the work that you're planning. And they propose feasible strategies and a budget that's appropriate to doing the work. And they invest their own cash and or in-kind resources in the initiative. So while you might not be asking for a portion of the executive director's salary, you want to reflect that in the budget, because in most cases the executive director is going to be spending a day or two a week or a month on the project. Likewise, your bookkeeper or finance manager. So while you might not necessarily be asking for it, you might be though, but if you're not, then make sure you do put a value on that and include it in your budget, because that really demonstrates that you are investing your resources in it. And you want to show that you're committed to achieving realistic and measurable outcomes, because again, funders are really interested in those outcomes and knowing that what they are supporting is going to make a difference. Okay, and if you receive a grant, you want to make sure that you thank the funder, follow any instructions they have. Some might say, you know, we'd like you to do a press release, or you need to provide acknowledgement in certain ways. So fulfill any requirements or conditions that they tell you they have. And then, of course, always make sure that you are following up with reports that they require, whether it's, you know, a final report, midterm report, any evaluations, your financial reports, and if they're asking for copies of the receipts, you need to make sure you include that. So again, it's all about following their directions. And maintain communication, you know, invite them for a site visit to see what you're doing if that's feasible. And make sure that you do provide any acknowledgement and recognition. So putting their logo on your website and on project materials, and anything else that they might require. And just to say that in your grant reports, think about the same kinds of characteristics that make a clear, concise, complete, and compelling and accurate grant application. You want to apply that in your grant report so that they want to read them. It's just not going through the motions, but in fact really tells them, you know, what happened with the project. And using photographs can be very powerful, and participant stories and quotes and photos is also a great way to help balance that intellectual and emotional appeal. And as I mentioned, invite them out to see what you're up to. So I will leave it with my top 11 tips, which I've already mentioned, but this just provides it in summary format to, you know, get organized, find the fit, frame it for the funder, remind them of why it's a great fit with what they're interested in, and absolutely always follow their instructions. Be compelling by reaching the head and the heart. Be bold, clear, and committed. Don't be saying we hope to, we'd like to, we plan to. Say we will throughout your application. And demonstrate your organizational capacity and credibility throughout, you know, making sure you have a really great description of your organization and what it's accomplished and what it does. Lead with the need, focus on outcomes, and always proofread several times, and if you can, have an outsider read. So we will leave it with some really good resources that go into a lot more depth on some of these things that we've talked about. Kellogg Foundation has some great material free online on evaluation, and this may date myself, but I still have my copy of the Elements of Style from high school English. But the good news is you can download it free of charge online, and it's a really great resource for good grammar, plain writing, and making sure that you're making every word count. And rely on each other. There's a lot of knowledge out there, and unfortunately a short webinar like this doesn't give us much of a chance to share stories and ideas and experiences and resources. But in future, we will have some longer workshops on a lot of different organizational development topics that will provide that opportunity. But in the meantime, certainly talk to each other and share the information that you have. Any questions? I know that we are past our 11 o'clock finish time, but if you've got any questions, we can stay around to take them.
Sure. Thank you so much, Barb. And I again, just like Barb just said, I know that we've run a little bit over time, so feel free to sign off if you need to run out. But just one question that has come in from Jane. If you do not get a grant, is it okay to ask why your grant was unsuccessful?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, some funders really make a point of telling you in great detail why you didn't. Some will actually, but this is more rare, some will actually meet with you and go over things and have a policy to sit down with you and let you know. And then there's others, of course, you don't hear a word and you don't have that opportunity, but it never hurts to ask. It's a very helpful, you know, because sometimes it's as simple a thing as, for many corporate funders, they start off in January with their grants budget, and by October or November it's depleted. There just isn't money left. And so you can apply a few months later when, you know, their new funding is available in January or February and might have a very good chance. So that would be very helpful to know that. And so, yeah, you can definitely contact them if they are reachable.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Barb. Just a couple of extreme thank yous from your fans out there saying that this is an extremely valuable webinar, and thank you so much for that. So if there is nothing further, I just want to thank Barb for her time and sharing her knowledge with us today. And thank everyone who attended and for taking the time to be present and engaged. As I did mention at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sharing the slides as well as the recording with all of the people who have registered for the event. So I know some people were unable to attend today, but we'll still make sure that they get that recording and the slides. So if there's nothing further, I thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Barb, for today.
Thanks, everyone.